I'm gonna start my fourth intervention. I'm ready. Steady, go. And there's my gym box. I'm gonna start now.
In this presentation, I'm going to provide you with an overview of the visual analysis of data. I find that this can be fairly complicated, and visual analysis of data is a little bit nuanced. I encourage you, as you become behavior analysts, to really consider including professional development related to the visual analysis of data. I typically make sure that whenever I go to ABA conferences, whether it's ABA or the ABAI Autism Conference or my local Hoosier Association for Behavior Analysis Conference, I try to go to seminars where they're talking about the visual analysis of data. I find that I always learn something, and it's a way to keep my skills sharp. I want to acknowledge the resources that I used in creating these slides. I used the Cooper, Heron, and Hayward textbook chapter, and then also some of their slides for instructors. There's a lot of material from your textbook. There are some visuals from Woolery, the Woolery article that you'll read a little bit later in the semester. And I found some good graphs demonstrating level and trend and variability on the Educate Autism website. And then a lot of the content is taken from the Institute of Education Sciences. I had the opportunity to attend a workshop about training graduate students in visual analysis. And so I've used a lot of the materials from that course that were developed by Rob Horner and Tom Cranwell and Joel Levin, John Farron, and Aaron Barton, and I have found it immensely helpful. But a lot of the content that I'm going to be teaching you or reviewing with you is information that I picked up from that workshop. So in applied behavior analysis, the tradition for analyzing data is really on the visual analysis of data. And whether you're a behavior analyst who's practicing, right, or if you become a researcher, you're really going to use visual analysis. So in your practice settings, whether it's a clinical setting like an ABA center or a hospital or a school, you can use visual analysis to help you make database decisions regarding the individuals with whom you work. And then in our published research in the field of applied behavior analysis, you'll see that as you're reading different publications, the trend or the go-to is typically visually analyzing data, and the authors will explain how they made phase change decisions and how they interpreted their data. There are some advances in the field of single case research design where there's a group of people who are starting to apply statistical analyses to single case research design. This is, the jury is still out on statistical analysis of single case research design. There are some concerns given the low number of participants, and I think that these procedures are certainly emerging, and it's where we will go. So in addition to visually analyzing data, we'll also compute statistical tests. There are multiple benefits of visual analysis of data, and these are discussed in further detail in the Gaston Ledford chapter that you'll read for this week. But one of the benefits is that visual analysis can be used to evaluate individual data or group data. So I can use visual analysis if I have data for one participant or 4 participants, or maybe I wanted to know if an intervention was effective for an entire classroom, and so I can collect data for that group. Another benefit of visual analysis of data is that it requires that we regularly collect data, graph those data, and then analyze data. And because we're constantly collecting data and analyzing our data, we know whether or not an intervention is working. We can make changes without letting an ineffective intervention drag on. So it allows us to make database decisions regarding clients and to make sure that we are including the most effective intervention and intervention components for each client. So in other words, it allows for individualization, right? We know that from group research design, the underlying premise is that we have large groups of participants who are randomly selected and assigned to different groups, maybe group A, B, or C. And we collect a whole bunch of data on those participants, but we basically just summarize those data by evaluating mean differences across the groups. So in group A, we don't know how participant 76 fared. Visual analysis of data lets us know how each individual client responded to the intervention. And so it's a little bit more of a conservative method. With group research and statistical analysis, it's pretty easy to find an effect if you have a large enough number of participants, even if an effect might not have been there. One of the things that your book talks about that I really like is that visual analysis helps us to identify serendipitous findings, so things that might have happened by accident. We're constantly looking at data and systematically manipulating the independent variable, and we might stumble across a happy accident or something that's interesting, just because through the process of collecting data and visually analyzing data. And I think that's one of the really neat things about our field. When we're considering visual analysis, one of the most important things that we need to look at is the number of data points that are plotted within a condition. You've heard me talk about the 3 versus 5 data points. So historically, 3 data points, a minimum of 3 data points was what we needed to establish trend. In recent years, that has changed a little bit, and according to the What Works Clearinghouse design standards, 3 data points is no longer sufficient, and it's recommended that within each condition there's a minimum of 5 data points. But I want to make the point to you that although 5 data points is necessary, it's not sufficient, especially if there are issues with trend or variability. And so we go back to the more is always better. One of the things that behavior analysts do and single case researchers do is we make sure that we are systematically manipulating the independent variables. And so we want to minimize the number of variables that we're changing between adjacent conditions. And this helps us to control for threats to internal validity. So when you are visually analyzing data, you'll want to consider what was changed in each phase. The other things that you'll look for are the level stability and change in level within and between conditions. So we'll talk about each of these in a little bit more detail, but you want to know what the mean level for the outcome variable was, and if that changed within a condition or between 2 different conditions. You'll also consider the trend direction, the trend stability, and then consider this trend within and between conditions. And then you'll look for the percentage of data points in one condition that fall within the range of data plotted in an adjacent condition. So I want to talk to you a little bit about within conditions and between conditions. So say that we have a simple AB graph. A would be a condition, right? And so we would want to look at the number of data points in that A phase, and then we would evaluate level, trend, and variability. In between conditions, we're going to compare data in adjacent conditions, and it's important to note that when you're making between conditions comparisons, you can only compare data in adjacent conditions. So in our AB graph, a between conditions comparison might be between A and B, or back between B and A. And when you're making between conditions comparisons, you can look at the level, trend, and variability between these conditions, but we also want to look at overlap, the immediacy of the effect, and then the consistency across similar phases. And we'll talk about these. So I want to make a note about this within and between series comparisons. When you're interpreting experimental control, you're always going to assess the whole study, all phases. You're not just going to look at the data in adjacent phases. So in that AB design that I mentioned, you would look at the A, the B, the A, and the B. And so you want to use all of your data to determine whether or not a functional relationship exists. When you are assessing a basic effect, this is done with adjacent phases, so the A to the B or the B to the A. And in order to determine a functional relationship, you're going to need at least 3 demonstrations of a basic effect. Make sure, though, that when you are looking to determine whether or not there's experimental control in a functional relationship, you're going to evaluate the data across all phases. And I know this is a little bit confusing. So visual analysis involves 4 different steps and 6 different variables, which I've mentioned earlier. So the 6 variables that we're going to consider are the level, trend, variability, overlap, immediacy of the effect, and the consistency across similar phases. And what we're going to look for is, first, are our baseline data adequate, and do they document a predictable pattern? And remember, by adequate, we want to consider the number of baseline data points, whether or not what the level was, the trend, and the variability in those data before we make decisions. And only once we determine if our baseline data are adequate, then we will start looking at whether or not the data within each phase allow a predictable pattern. So, say that our baseline documents a predictable pattern, and we know that we have good baseline data, then we can start looking at within phases. And we want to know, basically, if given the level, trend, and variability, do we feel confident that we can predict the next 3 or 4 data points without collecting those data? The next thing that we look at is whether or not the data between phases document a basic effect. So we'll look at that crossover between the phases, and if there's that change in overlap, if there's an immediacy of effect and consistency across similar phases. And then we'll look at our entire data set to see if there's experimental control. In a multiple baseline design, there is a 7th consideration in addition to the ones that we talked about. So the other thing that we need to see is stability in a non-intervened series when the effect is demonstrated in one series. I know this is confusing right now, but we'll talk about it more when we get to multiple baseline designs. But essentially, you'll have different panels. Say, for example, maybe you're implementing an intervention across 4 participants. And so once you have stability for the first participant, you can implement the intervention. You would hold the second participant in baseline until they have stability in their baseline data, and until there is an intervention effect in the series before. Again, I know that this is a little confusing when you're just listening to it, but hopefully it'll become more clear when we talk about multiple baseline designs. In alternating treatments designs and multi-element designs, there are a few additional considerations. So we want to look at the magnitude of the separation between the data paths. So the greater the difference between the 2 conditions, then the larger the demonstration of the functional relationship. You'll also look at the consistency of the separation. When there's less overlap, the greater the likelihood is that there's a functional relationship. And then again, the number of data points used to establish the separation. And so this goes back to the more is better. So I've mentioned this concept of level, trend, and variability, and I wanted to talk about each of these to make sure that it's something that you understand. So level is the value on the vertical axis around which a series of data points converge. It's the mean of the data within a phase. And when we have more stability, level becomes a more valuable measure. And so this graph over here, there's a lot of stability for each of these data sets, and so we can be confident in what reflects a high level, a moderate level, and a low level. When you're looking at the high level, notice where it is on the y-axis. It's up there, around 90 or 92. Versus the moderate level, we see that hovering around the middle of the y-axis. And low level, which is kind of down along the very bottom of the vertical axis. In the hash, trend has been described as basically the overall direction taken by the data path. The technical definition for trend is the slope of the best fit straight line describing data within a phase. You'll notice that there are
Hasta the time is done.